The smell of cinnamon and apples filled the small kitchen as Emily Parker carefully pulled the pie from the oven. Golden steam rose into the air. For a moment she simply stood there staring at it, not because it was the best pie she had ever baked, but because she had nobody to share it with. The silence inside the house felt heavier than usual. No television, no conversation, no laughter, just silence. At 58 years old, Emily had gotten used to being alone, or at least she told herself she had. Her husband, Robert, had passed away 7 years earlier after a sudden heart attack. One ordinary morning he had kissed her goodbye before work. That evening he never came home. The loss had shattered her world. Friends promised they would stay close. Most disappeared. Family members visited less and less. Her son lived 3 states away. Her daughter was busy raising children of her own. Everyone had their own lives. And Emily spent most evenings sitting alone on her porch watching sunsets that felt far less beautiful than they once had. She glanced out the kitchen window. Across the street sat a modest white house. Its owner was outside watering flowers, Thomas Bennett, age 63, widower, former carpenter. The quiet man everyone in the neighborhood respected. 3 years earlier, Thomas had lost his wife, Margaret, after a long battle with cancer. Since then, he lived alone, much like Emily. Most mornings she saw him tending his garden. Most evenings she saw him sitting quietly on his porch, always alone, always carrying a sadness that never completely left his eyes. Emily looked down at the pie, then toward Thomas's house. A small smile appeared. Maybe sharing it would do both of them some good. She carefully covered the pie with foil, then walked across the street. As she approached, Thomas looked up from his flowers. "Well now," he said with a warm smile. "What do I owe this surprise?" Emily held up the pie. "I made too much." Thomas laughed. "No such thing as too much pie," she smiled. "That's exactly what my husband used to say." The mention of Robert created a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just familiar, the kind of silence shared by people who understood grief. Thomas slowly nodded. Margaret said the same thing. For a moment neither spoke. Then Thomas opened his front door. "Come inside. We should at least test this pie properly." Emily hesitated, then agreed. The house felt surprisingly warm. Family photographs covered the walls, pictures of vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, a lifetime of memories. Emily noticed one photo sitting alone on a table, Thomas and Margaret smiling together beside a lake. The frame showed signs of being touched often. Thomas followed her gaze. "I still talk to her sometimes." Emily looked at him. "So do I." Thomas chuckled softly. "Good. Now I don't feel crazy." The first time in a very long time, Emily laughed from the heart. Not the polite laugh she gave strangers, not the forced laugh she used when people asked how she was doing. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't felt in years. They sat at the kitchen table eating pie. 1 slice became 2, 2 slices became coffee, coffee became stories, stories became hours. Before either realized it, the afternoon sun had started setting. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "You know something?" "What?" "This is the most I've talked in months." Emily smiled. "Me too." Thomas shook his head. "It's strange." "Is?" He looked around the quiet house. "You can spend years surrounded by people and still feel lonely." Emily nodded. "And sometimes one conversation changes everything." Their eyes met. For a brief moment neither looked away, then both quickly glanced elsewhere. The feeling surprised them, not because it was romantic, not yet, but because it felt good. And after years of loss, feeling good could be frightening. As evening arrived, Emily stood to leave. Thomas walked her to the front door. The sky glowed orange and gold. The neighborhood looked peaceful. For the first time in a long time, neither wanted the conversation to end. Then Thomas smiled mischievously. "If I were 20 years younger." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Oh," he pointed toward the empty pie dish. "I'd marry the woman who baked this pie." Emily burst into laughter. Thomas laughed too, but neither completely ignored the strange warmth those words created. As she walked back home, she found herself smiling. The joke should have been harmless, simple, forgettable. Yet somehow it stayed with her. That night while getting ready for bed, she caught herself thinking about Thomas. The way his eyes softened when he talked about Margaret, the way he listened, the way he understood grief without needing explanations. Most people avoided conversations about loss. Thomas never did, because he carried the same burden. Across the street, Thomas sat alone on his porch. The empty pie plate rested beside him. The evening breeze moved through the trees. His thoughts drifted toward Emily. He hadn't expected that. For years he had convinced himself that part of his life was over. Margaret had been his soulmate, his best friend. His entire world. Loving someone else felt impossible, even disloyal. But today had felt different, not because he wanted to replace Margaret. That could never happen. Nobody could replace her. Yet for the first time in years, he had looked forward to tomorrow. And that realization frightened him. The following morning, Emily stepped outside to collect her newspaper. A small box sat on her porch. Confused, she picked it up. Inside was a handwritten note, along with a freshly carved wooden bird. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The note read, "Thank you for the pie. It reminded me that good things still exist." Thomas. Emily stared at the bird. Tears unexpectedly filled her eyes, not because of the gift, but because someone had thought about her. Someone had taken the time. Someone cared. After years of feeling invisible, that meant more than Thomas could possibly know. Later that afternoon, she crossed the street carrying a small basket. Thomas opened the door. His eyes widened. "Oh no," Emily smiled. "Oh yes." Inside the basket sat homemade cookies. Thomas laughed. "We're entering dangerous territory." "What territory?" "The territory where neighbors start spoiling each other." Emily grinned. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Thomas looked at her for a second longer than usual. "No," his voice softened. "Maybe it isn't." Days turned into weeks. The pie became cookies. The cookies became shared dinners. The dinners became evening walks. And gradually something extraordinary happened. The loneliness that had defined both of their lives began to fade. Neighbors started noticing. People whispered, people speculated, some smiled, others judged. Because small towns always talked, especially when two widowed people spent time together. One afternoon, Emily overheard two women gossiping at the grocery store. "You think it's too soon?" "Too soon. Her husband died 7 years ago." "I still think it looks strange." Words hurt more than she wanted to admit. That evening she sat quietly on her porch. Thomas noticed immediately. He crossed the street. "What's wrong?" Emily tried to smile. "Nothing." Thomas sat beside her. "That's a lie," she sighed, then told him everything, the gossip, the whispers, the judgment. When she finished, Thomas stared toward the sunset, then spoke quietly. "You know what Margaret told me before she died?" Emily shook her head. Thomas swallowed hard. "She said, 'Promise me you won't spend the rest of your life alone.'" Emily's eyes widened. Thomas continued. "She knew she was leaving." His voice cracked. "And she didn't want loneliness to become my future." Silence filled the porch. Then Emily whispered, "Robert said something similar." Thomas turned toward her. "What did he say?" A tear rolled down her cheek. "He told me that if happiness ever found me again, not to run from it." For a long moment neither spoke. The evening sun disappeared below the horizon. And somewhere deep inside both of them, walls that had stood for years began to crack. Neither knew where their friendship was leading. Neither knew what the future held. But for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer looked empty. And neither of them realized that a life-changing surprise was about to arrive in their quiet neighborhood, one that would test their bond, uncover a decades-old secret, and force them to choose between fear and the possibility of a second chance at love.